Greetings. I got it.
Thanks, Katie.
Oops. I don't know if I can get it to go away. There we go. Oh, shoot. Oh, I can't get the meeting thing to go away. Let's think. Oh, well. Now I've lost my pointer.
No, I see your point. Well, your point.
Yeah, but I can't go up there and get rid of that sign that says being recorded.
Oh, well, I'll just push OK. That's what I did. It says.
Oh,
okay.
no, it won't go. It won't go on top of it.
Go away. Okay. Well, there you have it. Life's like that.
Life is like that. So there we go. Laser pointer. There. All righty.
Success. Yay, Penny.
Great. So greetings from Maine. We have our technical problem done and solved. Thank you so much for letting me share the London Letters home of Gus Farley Jr. I thought it might be of interest to you because he's a local boy. He's from an Ipswich family. He's 17, a 17-year-old boy going out into the big world about the time of the Civil War. And his mother actually did spend a year going to the school that is part of the Essex Museum. Gus wrote about 90 letters home between 1861 and 1865 from London, where he went to apprentice in the tea trade, preparing to go to China to join his cousins, his Ipswich cousins in the firm of Augustine Heard and Company. I've tried to put a little bit of a maritime focus on this because you guys are a shipbuilding museum. So I wasn't planning on putting this book together. Indeed, Gus, who was my great-grandfather, was really not on my radar. He was just the answer to the question why my grandfather had been born in Japan. The answer was because his father had been a tea merchant in Yokohama. I'm not sure if I even knew Gus's name. And then in the 90s, I was in London at a youth hostel standing in the breakfast line, and I met Satsuki Yamashita. And she was intrigued that my grandparents had lived in Japan. So when she got home, she sent me this map of Yokohama and a picture of the tea label that was the tea label of the company. And this unexpected gift started my adventure. Then the project really took off when I found out that my cousin Rob had Gus's letters. Reading the first letter, I got to hear Gus's voice, and the 150 years between us evaporated. And of course, I ended up transcribing the 90 letters. Was Gus remarkable? Probably not. Was he a man of action? Not really. But his letters opened up a world for me. And in an obituary that described him, I think it captures what he brings to the table. It says he was a companion of unfailing amiability and responsiveness, as one who, though reticent of speech and of retiring ways, combined rich and interesting experience with a fund of special information, which was ever a delight to call upon. So here's some of his special information. So Gus heads out on his adventures in 1861 when he was 17. And I'm just going to give you an overview of what happened to him. He was, of course, in Charles Dickens's London. And he actually read Great Expectations, which was hot off the press on his Atlantic voyage over to England. Gus was young and naive and alone in the big smoke. He encountered bullies in the lodging place, the hoi polloi crowding across London Bridge, clerks and fellow apprentices in the city, kind landladies, welcoming families, demeaning employers at Bullivant and Wilson, and really some kind ones at Ripleys on Mincing Lane. He roamed the streets of London. He entered the commercial auction house, the post office, the customs house, and the docks. He rode to work on the Metropolitan subway line, which was the first subway in the whole world. He ventured out into the countryside. He visited Scotland and Paris, and he attended a Scottish church where he met some young ladies from Nova Scotia. And he made a best friend. At Ripley's, there are two other young fellows whom I like very much. They are preparing to go to China. There is one about my age who is situated about the same as I am, i.e. not a lot of money. He's from Glasgow, Scotland. So now this is just a picture to give us a little bit of context of 1861. Gus was entering the workforce during the Victorian Industrial Revolution. We're thinking steam power factories, growing cities, the first subway line, ocean-going steamships, railways, canals. The communication is changing with the telegraph lines. that when Gus got to England, the telegraph lines went from England over to China overland. They hadn't gotten across the Atlantic yet. And then money was changing, money moving was changing. A merchant no longer needed to have a treasure chest in his treasury, but there was letters of credit. And what did tea mean to Gus? Well, I think that they would have meant that tea was precious because people kept it in lockable little tea caddies. And then, of course, the Tea Party, the Boston Tea Party of 1773. Gus's great-grandfather was a selectman in Ipswich at that time, and he helped write some resolutions for the town in which they promised that no tea would be imported and no tea would be sold. Ironically, for Farley tradition, these resolutions were disregarded by his own wife, Elizabeth Choate. She still liked her tea, and she would sneak up to her friend Mrs. Heard's house for an illicit cup. And so her house would be here, and she would go here and go over the Choate Bridge and go up the hill to the Heard house and have her cup of tea, because of course tea is mildly addicting. Now, Mrs. Heard is of interest because it was her son, Augustine, who paved the way for Gus to go to China. Augustine went to sea at 15 in 1800. He worked his way up to captain, making a fortune on the seven seas. In 1841, when Gus, 3 years before Gus was even born, and he was about 56, he had retired from the sea, but then he decided to take his eldest nephew, John, off to China and start a trading company. He went out in Mr. Appleton's new ship, the Mary Ellen, and to be certain she would not be sailed by a drone, that's his word, he took the management of her into his own hands. In Canton, he founded Augustine Heard, which became one of the foremost American merchant houses in China. And he bought tea for clients, and he sold legally and illegally opium to the Chinese. So Gus must have grown up with stories of Augustine Heard and the tea trade. Gus and his nephew were in Canton or Gansu during the Opium Wars. And when the foreign settlement went up in flames, Heard's had $500,000 in gold bullion in the treasury. This would be 1841. John wrote, "It only remains for me to say that we owe everything to the coolness and the presence of mind of Uncle Augustine. He encouraged us by his voice, animated us by his example, was everywhere, did everything, and to him belongs the credit for saving the vast amount of money." I gather they had to lug it out and get it on these lighters, so it must have been heavy work. Augustine was childless, so his four nephews would end up taking over the firm in the 1850s. And these would be the men who were Gus's first cousins, and they would be the ones that would hire Gus to come out to China. And here they are. This is, of course, a later picture, but we have Albert, and we have George, and we have John, and we have Augustine Jr. Now, Gus did not grow up with this band of brothers. They were 7 to 20 years older than he was, but they did welcome him into their business, and they organized his apprenticeship in London, and they found a mentor for him who was Charles Farron. And I think he made all the difference to have somebody there guiding him through his years in London. In his letters, Gus gives us a glimpse of these four brothers. Albert wants a young fellow out in China immediately. George is a tip-top fellow. I had a little talk with John, and he gave me some good advice. Augustine Jr. sends a great deal of love. And here's a photograph of where Gus was going. This is a Heard establishment in Hong Kong in the 1860s. In 1862, as Gus was just coming on board, John Heard was leaving, being in charge of the house, and he was giving it over to his brother, Albert. And he wrote, "I left the house firmly established, rich, and second to no other American house in China. Indeed, I doubt if many would not have called it the first. And yes, their lifestyle was rather grand. There were French chefs, there was champagne in an expat world. I think it must have been like living in one's own gentleman's club." And did Gus think that the easy life was waiting for him in Hong Kong? This is an image that shows you the marvelous harbor that Hong Kong has. And I believe that this building right here is the Heard building. In London, Gus actually saw the money rolling in because tea trading was really quite lucrative. At Bullivant Wilson, where Gus apprenticed, he wrote, "You can imagine something of the business we do when I tell you that our banker account has £100,000 in it, which would be about 13 million today." Of Ripley Brothers, the other firm where Gus wrote, he noted that twice some days they made 300 to 400 pounds above expenses. But I think that was more important to Gus was he met a young man who was under 30, and he had been out in China for 7 years, and he had made over 30,000 pounds. And I must say, I wondered what Gus would be doing as a tea taster. I didn't have that concept of a job at all. So I looked a little bit into the background of tea, and tea grows on trees, which are pruned into bushes. You can see this plantation over here, and it's pruned into bushes so that it's easier to pick. It all comes from the same plant, Camellia sinensis. That would be the black and the green teas. The difference being often how long they are processed over fire. And here there's a little fire in here, and this man is processing some tea. And then, of course, what you need, because there's so many varieties, is you need a tea taster in China to help inform the purchasing. And that would be Gus's job. And after you purchase it, you bring it, the tea is delivered down to your go down or your factory, and they are putting it into the tea chests. The tea chests they have these sheets of lead in them, and these fellows are treading the tea down to pack it down, and they're wearing special shoes with spikes on them. And they have a pair of these shoes at the Peabody Essex Museum. And then here they're weighing the chests, and they weigh them for, making records for how many they're saying abroad. And then here they are being loaded onto lighters to go out to the seagoing ships. And here is another picture showing the whole picture all in one. And up at the top is the cultivation. And here is the processing coming down the hill. This one shows the wall that the Chinese prevented the Westerners from wandering around in the hinterland of China. They had to stay down in their go downs. And here again, we can see somebody hammering the top on a chest, some Westerners making records, tamping down the leaves, weighing chests, and putting them on the lighters. And this picture I love very much because it shows you the ocean going ship out here. And the from Canton to Whampoa, where the ships were anchored, was about 16 miles. And Whampoa is just in from Hong Kong. And this map will show us, let me see, there we go. This map shows us, this map is just British trade routes before 1800, and it's from ship's logs, and it just gives us an idea of where people were taking their ships. And to get the tea into an English teapot in the old days took 18 to 24 months. And they would go out in the big square rigged East Indiamen, which were called tea wagons, and they would sail on the favorable monsoon winds. But desire for the first season's teas and the clipper ship's existence after the War of 1812, they cut the voyage down to 3 months, with the tea arriving in September. Now, of course, looking at this map, Gus is living at a time when everything is changing, just like us. And we're going to change the whole shape of the world. We're going to put in the Suez Canal in 69. The Transcontinental Railway will go into 69. There will be a mail ship route that goes from Hong Kong to San Francisco. So all of a sudden, you can go around the world, practically north of the equator. And also the line will go in, the telegraph line will connect Europe to North America. So things are changing. And here's the Cutty Sark. She is actually a tea clipper. She was one of the last tea clippers that was built. She was built in 1869 in Glasgow, Scotland. She has been rebuilt and is at the Greenwich Maritime Museum. You can go on board her. Now, her name is Cutty Sark, and I looked it up. It turns out to be archaic for a short night dress. And the name comes from a poem by Robert Burns about a farmer who was chased by a witch across a field wearing a scanty nightgown. Now, the online, that they didn't have any clue about what this meant for a name of a ship, but there you go. Here is the loading of a clipper ship. So when you're shipping something 14,000 miles, you want to make sure you do a good job packing your ship. And so first they would put in a layer of shingle down here, nice clean shingle. It would be 150 to 200 tons of shingle. You would level it off, then putting in the least expensive boxes of chests of tea, and then the more expensive ones would go on top, and it would have some kind of batting or dunnage between them. You can see the fellow packing it in really tight so it's not going to move. And here's the lighter coming alongside, and the boxes, the boxes are in general are 100, 133 pounds. So they're just tossing them up overboard. There's the tally man counting the boxes coming on board. And we have one Westerner overseeing the lot. Oh, and the time occupied in loading a ship could be between a fortnight to 2 months. Once, though, in the 1850s, 8,000 chests of tea and 1,000 bales of silk were loaded in 17 hours. And this is my transition picture to get us back to Massachusetts. Old and young shipbuilders. Good old Winslow Homer does such a beautiful job illustrating New England childhood. And here is Gus's passport. What do we know about Gus? Well, this is his passport application. And you can see he's 17. His height is 5 feet 5.5 inches. His forehead is medium. His eyes are hazel. His nose is straight. His mouth is full. His chin is round. His hair is brown. His complexion fair. And his face is long. And he is going to Europe. And when he got to England, he weighed himself on the scales in the docks, and he weighed 129 pounds. And I wondered why Gustavus. It doesn't sound like a very New Englandy name. And my best guess is that he and his father, who was born in 1814, were named after the Dunkirk pirate, who was Gustavus Conyngham, who was one of the most successful continental naval captains. And he captured 24 ships between 1877 and May of 1878. But that's just a guess. I don't know if that's why he has the name Gustavus. And what kind of a chap was our Gus? Well, his sister Eunice, who is here, wrote quite a bit about him. And she wrote, "As I was one of the children in this picture, I can tell you all about our dear big brother, who we thought was the nicest and the handsomest boy in the world. He was always whistling and turning somersaults and singing. And the only reason he ever got scolded was because he left his lessons to the last thing. The boys in those days used to talk a great deal about going to sea. That was because we lived near the sea and they saw ships and sailors. Here is a Marblehead poem, or part of a poem from the 1900s that perhaps captures some of the boys' enchantment. The old clipper days were jolly when we sailed the 7 seas, and the house flags of our merchant ships were whipped by every breeze. It was goodbye to your mother and the pretty girls on shore, for we're off around the howling Horn, bound down to Singapore. We romped the rushing trade winds and we raced the big monsoon. We carried reeling royals from Manila to Rangoon. We were chased by Malay pirates from Natura to Penang, and we drove her scuppers under to outsail the cutthroat gang." It also turns out that Gus's father went on a voyage when he was 14 years old. And here is his school essay that he wrote when he was 14, when he got back. And it says, a voyage to St. Thomas on the 25th of March, 1828, about 7 o'clock in the evening. We sailed from Boston with a northwestern reef topsail mainsail bound to St. Thomas. There we go. And by 4 o'clock in the morning, we had passed Nantucket Lights. And on it goes. I also like his comment on the other page. It says, ridiculous composition, not fit to be seen. Well, sorry. So who was Gus writing to? Well, he was writing to his parents and his 4 sisters. He had a very friendly relationship with his father, which I think makes the letters open and informative. He wrote, "When I read of your hiring Pat Ryan to get the manure from the barn cellar, I almost envied him. I should like to spend the remainder of the afternoon in that very work in that very place. I look back at the happy hours I spent at home, and when in joke you used to tell me, I did not know what a good time I was having. It makes me feel kind of ticklish. And what you said is perfectly true." And Gus had a very fond relationship with his mother, often hoping that she was visiting in Ipswich and not getting too overworked. Interestingly, Gus's mother did not have the colonial background that most Farley spouses had. Amelia Fredrika Newman wasn't American. She wasn't even English. She was a Swede from Göteborg. And here you can see Göteborg is here. It's a great harbor for Sweden. Very easy to get out to the sea as opposed to going all the way around the peninsula. The town of Göteborg was a purpose-built military town with fortified walls and a moat. And it was probably the 17th, 18th century design. So Amelia was born in 1822. Her father was a sea captain who had American friends, Captain and Mrs. Gardner from Ipswich, who often came to visit him. And as the Gardners had no children, they made a pet of little Amelia, and they wished to take her back to America. But Amelia's father deferred, saying, "When I am on the rough and stormy sea, I think of my little girl in her warm bed. I always feel so gay and happy when I come home. But if I should never return from a winter voyage, perhaps her mother will let you take her to America." Well, there came a voyage from which he never returned, and they had to come to the sad conclusion that his ship was lost with everyone on board. And this is the wonders of the internet. I talked to somebody over the internet, and here is the 1832 shipping news from Göteborg. And you can see the American brig Neptune arriving in Canso, which is the quarantine island that you need to go to before you are allowed to come to the city. And there is Captain Gardner, and the ship is owned by J.J. Halstead. And on board, they are bringing sacks of sugar, Manila sugar and Muscovade sugar, and they are bringing cotton, and they're bringing tea, and they're bringing tobacco. So, and Amelia did end up sailing back with them, and this is November, and she sailed back with them in December, and she had her number 10 birthday on board the ship in the North Atlantic. And the Gardners took Amelia to the Brown farm in Ipswich, probably on Candlewood Road, where Mrs. G's mother lived. And Amelia became very happy there, and she learned to speak English, which is a plus. She went to a boarding school in Essex, which is your school building. And she learned much in a short time, as it was a very fine school kept by Master David Choate. The school was an experimental coeducational high school, as opposed to a college prep school like Exeter, just for boys. It was inspired by the German educational reforms. And here is a picture, and I believe this is probably the Gardner child, because the reason she could only go to school, stay in the school for a year, was because Mrs. Gardner went and had a child, and Amelia was pulled into service to mind the child. And so I always expect that the ship out here is to remind the child that his parents are on the sea. And here's a quick snapshot of Gus's 4 sisters, Caroline, Eunice, Elizabeth, and Delia. More later, not later, but another book, another story. So I wondered, would Gus be able to hold his own in London? Now, he came from Boston, with the deep water harbor. It was a large American city renowned for its merchants and ministers and scholars and public leaders, and it had a population of about 200,000. But where was he going? He was going to England. He was going to London, which was a vast, sprawling city of 3+ million people. London was the heart of the British Empire, with its aristocrats and royalty. It had a standing, indeed, a paraded mounted soldiers. It had maritime might. It had innovators. It was a commercial giant. It just wasn't Boston. And then on top of that, when I was working with the letters, it dawned on me that Gus's father was not able to support his family very well. He had what the family called reverses. Gus's father had been a leather broker with offices near Faneuil Hall. Before 1850, being a leather broker was quite a good business. But once the factories of the Industrial Revolution came on board and the shoes and saddles and other leather goods were made there, the owners cut out the brokers, and they procured the raw materials from California and as far away as Calcutta themselves. And then on top of it, it began also to figure out that Gus's apprenticeship was unpaid, and that he was living on an allowance that his father could ill afford to send him. He kept on writing things like, "Trust me, my dear parents, I shall spend as little as I possibly can." And then I came across these pictures of Heard's actual staff. And this is the year that Gus will turn up in China, and the people seated indoors. I believe these would be the partners, and the fellows on the stairs, I believe, would be the clerks. And it turns out that China was no longer a place where you could just turn up. A merchant in 1860 wrote, "I cannot advise anyone to think of coming to China. Situations in good houses are as hard to procure here as at home. The work is harder and the promotion slower. Every ship that arrives brings some young man who has come to seek his fortune. The supply is greater than the demand." And indeed, Gus getting his T certificate, it wasn't a given. He'd had a cousin that had gone out probably 1 or 2 years earlier, and there wasn't a ghost of a chance of his succeeding. And I think that Gus shared this with his cousin, George, with whom he made his first trip across the Atlantic, because there's a letter from George in which is encouraging Gus. And he writes, I have no doubt you will turn out okay and be a shining light for your family. Only keep a stiff upper lip and don't be discouraged. And the other major pressure on Gus, before leaving, this poor 17-year-old, was the Civil War. And yes, I think it's very likely that Gus's family hustled him. He was the only son out of the country, and he certainly didn't regret it. He wrote, there's not a day passes, but I congratulate myself on not being a soldier, as I very probably would be if I were at home. The horrors of the war are certainly awful. But it did create tension between his mother and him. He wrote, never mind, mother, I have the same regard for my country as ever, but I think a little differently, being away from the scene of excitement. I don't know, but you would think me all right if you would hear the discussions of the American question in our office in the manner in which I stand up and brag about America and its institutions. So now it's time to get Gus to London. So he sailed in September of 1861 on the SS Arago, and he accompanied his cousin George, who was about 7 years older than he was. Gus said goodbye to his family, expecting to go, do not pass go, do not collect $200. He was heading straight on to China after his apprenticeship. And he wrote, I must not think of going home for a long time. It also must have been strange coming down in the train from Boston, because there must have been full of young men dressed up as soldiers ready to go to the front. And here is a lovely map of Manhattan. Of course, it's from 1873, so it's not exactly what Gus would have seen, but we have the Hudson River coming down here. It looks to me as though the steamships are coming in on this side, and then on this side, which is Old South Street, which was the original harbor of New York, the clipper ships are coming in with their bowsprits going across the street. We have Battery Park, we have Trinity Church. Heading up Broadway, you get to Central Park. Okay, now Gus describes his voyage across the Atlantic. The pilot was discharged off Sandy Hook. By the next morning, we were entirely out of sight of land. We had a very pleasant passage regards to weather, but I was sick a greater portion of the voyage. The Arago is a slow but very safe boat. The fastest they went was 286 miles in one day. They passed Sable Island and were saluted, and we arrived off Cape Race, Newfoundland, about 1:30 Wednesday night. And on firing a gun, a boat came off from the lighthouse, received some dispatches, and George telegraphed his father. And this here is, on the other end of the voyage, Gus's adventure almost ended in disaster. This is sort of a generic picture of a steamship and a steam tug. And over here you have the south of England. We have the English Channel. We have the Isle of Wight. We have Cowes, and we have Southampton, where Gus was headed. As it was rather foggy, we could not see as much of the land as we wished. We made Cowes on the Isle of Wight about 2:00 in the morning. We came to and fired several guns and displayed fireworks. After waiting about an hour and a half, a small dingy-looking little steamer came alongside. We found out that the regular tender had started for us, but had burst her boiler, and this one had come in her stead. So Gus said goodbye to George, who was going on to Calais, and got on the steamer with the other passengers for England. After proceeding a short distance, a dense fog set in. We found out that the captain of the steamer was drunk. We were going along very quietly when we heard cries of port, port. Then all at once there loomed from the fog a very large steamer who was coming down upon us with full speed. The captain of our steamer ordered the engines to be stopped, which was just the wrong thing, as the larger steamer had checked her speed. The man at the helm jammed the wheel over, and the larger steamer just grazed past us. I assure you, I and all on board thought our hour had come. After this excitement, the captain became bewildered, and after running the vessel aground twice, we made the pier at 4:00 in the morning. From Southampton, Gus took the train to London and got his first glimpse of England. I took the 11:30 train to London. The whole country looked like one great garden. When I arrived at 3:00, I was very much fatigued. And here is London. And you can see that it is not a seaport like Boston, but it has a river snaking through it. This would be the Houses of Parliament, Westminster Abbey, Buckingham Palace. There you have St. Paul's Cathedral, and over here you have the Tower of London, and right there is London Bridge. On Gus's first day, he discovered that his mentor, Mr. Farron, was away, that no job had been lined up for him, and that he was not properly attired. Indeed, he lacked a tile, which turns out to be a top hat. He wrote, "Saturday morning, I took a cab and drove down to Mr. Farron's office at 23 Old Broad Street. I found Mr. Farron had not returned from Russia. I still never found out what he was doing in Russia, something to do with guns or railways, but would probably be in London on Tuesday or Wednesday, when everything would be arranged in reference to me. So I delivered my letters to Mr. Node, his partner, who received me very politely. Mr. Node and I went up the monument, which was erected at the point where the Great Fire of London stopped, which was about 200 feet high. We could see for miles, but it was so foggy and smoky, I think polluted, we could not see the whole city. After going up the monument, Mr. Node took Gus to a hatter's, where Gus bought an uncomfortable tile. It turned out to be, the tile was a top hat, and it cost him 15 shillings. Now, 15 shillings doesn't sound like very much, but me and my math trying to change, do all the work there, the conversions, I think it was about $200 nowadays for this hat, which was a huge unexpected expense for somebody on a tight budget. And then he found out that his suits were deficient. You can have no idea to what extent the custom in regard to dress is carried here. Anyone is not considered hardly decent who shows himself in the street without a black hat and coat on, so much so that I was obliged to have my gray suit dyed black. Now, this is a chart of Augustine Heard, and it is kind of the world when people were calculators and copiers. It shows the cost of tea coming down in this column, and then the price in shillings and pence going across the top. And in this lower corner, it gives you sort of how you would set up a bill of sale, adding freight and insurance and other things so that everybody would be selling the same way. And Gus wrote, "You have no idea what a difficult thing it is to get a situation of the right character in the tea business. There are so many applicants and the houses are so full that it is doing a great favor to take a young man to teach him the business." But while they waited, Mr. Farron employed Gus writing in his office. Gus wrote, "Writing is copying for the most part. Mr. Farron told me that when he first went to work, which was when he was about my age, he had nothing to do but for 3 years but copy letters. This was in China, and he says he considers it one of the best things a young man can do." So here's another image of Gus's London. And again, we have the river coming through. We have London Bridge. There's the Tower. There is St. Paul's, Hyde Park, and that's Regent's Park. There's Paddington Station. There is Buckingham Palace, the Parliament, the Abbey. And here we have the docks. And these are going to be the docks that will be so horribly bombed in World War II. And I am going to, Gus had his first boarding house was over here on this side of the river. Then he lived over on this side of the river in two or three different boarding houses. But his first boarding house was this. "I will tell you the manner in which I live. I have a small bedroom up 6 flights of stairs with uncarpeted floors and unpapered walls, 2 pine chairs, a small bedstead, and a bureau. I have my breakfast and my tea in the house and my dinner in town. I live principally upon bread and butter. There are 3 other young fellows living here, 2 of whom are in the tea trade." And Gus walked across London Bridge every day when he was living on that side of the river. Indeed, 200,000 people walked to work in London. And of course, that's the population of Boston. They didn't all walk across London Bridge, but there we go. And Gus wrote to his little sister, who was about 3 when he left, "Then Miss Delia thinks that she would like to be on London Bridge. I do not think she would like it more than once, for of all the places to be in, I think it one of the most disagreeable, for there is the greatest crowd of fish peddlers and great baskets of fish on their head, and hawkers of all kinds, all in a great rush to get across the bridge." Now, here is this marvelous panorama of London. And if I'd known I was going to be giving a talk, I would have done a better job taking pictures. But here we have London Bridge. Here we have the monument that they went up. This is the Customs House here. There is the Tower of London. Here are some of the enclosed docks. And this is fascinating because you can see the river with all the clipper ships rafted up in it. And a French historian described this scene in 1860. And this is translated, obviously. The number of canals by which the docks open onto the river are streets of ships. Their innumerable riggings stretch a vast circle of spiderweb all around the rim of the sky. It's one of the mighty spectacles of our planet. The docks are prodigious, overwhelming, inhabited by a population of three-masted ships from every corner of the world. A merchant who had come to check on the arrival of spices from Java and a transshipment of ice from Norway told me that about 40,000 ships enter the docks every year, and that as a rule, there were between 5,000 and 6,000 in the docks at any moment. So Mr. Farron made arrangements for Gus to work with the firm of Ripley Brothers. And this is, again, I just love maps, obviously. The Customs House, he is working on Mincing Lane right here, which is the street of tea. Over here is Old Broad Street, where Mr. Farron had his office. Gus will also apprentice in Cheapside, which turns out to be the name of the street. And Leadenhall Street is where the East India Company was based. And there's St. Catherine's Docks and London's Docks or Victoria Docks. And the building that Gus was in with Ripley Brothers had probably about 20 different businesses in it. Mincing Lane, if you go there now, there's nothing there that would make you think it was the street of tea. But at Ripley Brothers, Gus made a best friend, and his name was James Mollison. At Ripley's, there are two other young fellows whom I like very much. They are preparing to go to China. James Mollison, the young man I spoke of in my last, is a splendid fellow in every sense of the word. On their time off, they explored London and went on great walks into the countryside, and they ended up in the same boarding house. Gus and Mollison remained friends for the rest of their lives. They were bachelors together for 14 years in Yokohama, and they brought their brides out the same year in 1880, and their first children were born within months of each other. In 1933, Mollison wrote to Gus's widow, because poor Gus died at 54 before the turn of the century. He wrote, "I had my 86th birthday on Monday, and Gustavus, had he been with us, would have been celebrating the same, and no doubt asking me to have another slice of this succulent tongue, as he used to do in London and other places where we spent happy times together." And I'm going to give you just a few little glimpses of what it was like to be in London from Gus. The London fogs, imagine the atmosphere of yellowish drab color, so thick you can hardly see across the street. It penetrates every place and turns everything it comes in contact with jet black. And here you can see the disasters of the fog. There's somebody getting pickpocketed. You need to have people carrying torches to lead the horses. And this little fellow was probably paid by this couple to lead them through the streets, and hopefully they won't lead you to a cul-de-sac and rob you blind. Of mud, of all the places for mud, London is the worst. The streets and the sidewalks are covered with about an inch of black, puddingly, greasy mud. And when you go out in the street, you must wear a pair of leggings. And then you can form no conception of what a place for dissipation London is. I can assure you it requires a great deal of will, and he doesn't give us any other stories, to keep on the right track. I have seen more of life in the past short year than in my whole lifetime. And finally, I do pity the poor of London, as there are so many and they are so wretchedly poor. It's really very dangerous to go out in some of the streets in broad daylight. So the Civil War came to England with the burning of the Harvey Birch. He wrote, "There's great excitement in Southampton on Thursday, occasioned by the arrival of the Confederate steamship, the Nashville. She came up with the Confederate flag flying at the main. At the mouth of the channel, she had captured the American ship, the Harvey Birch, and after taking officers and crew prisoners, they set her on fire. On coming up to Southampton, she landed the prisoners, which was protested against by the superintendent of the Admiralty, as it would be a breach of neutrality on the part of the Queen to allow prisoners to be landed there." And all during Gus's time in England, he was afraid that he would be cut off from home. Mr. Farron told me the dreadful news that war between England and the federal government was inevitable. "If war should prevent communication between us, I will stand by the North," he wrote. For the Civil War, as we saw with the Harvey Birch, was not just fought on land, it was also waged at sea. The South attacked the merchant shipping, and the North blockaded the South to prevent them from selling their cotton to the English mills. The lack of cotton in England caused many of the mills to close, and many mill workers were displaced. It was a time known as the cotton famine because so many people in England died. Back to Gus's world. Before the docks were enclosed, ships were built. The ships were anchored midstream and cargoes were unloaded onto lighters. Pilfering was rife and tidal fluctuations made things difficult. These and other inconveniences caused the powers that be to dig dock basins into the land on either side of the Thames. These basins were lined with stone and surrounded by fortress-like walls of fireproof warehouses. The water level in the basins was controlled with huge locks using canal technology. And here's another image. There we go. Each year, millions of pounds of tea arrived on clipper ships, which sailed 14,000 miles from Foochow to London around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa. And we loaded up a clipper ship, and now let's unload it. Here you can see the mast and the rigging of the ship, and then you can see the hundreds of tea chests all over underneath the protected docks. And this is a special swan-necked trolley for moving the tea chests around because they, are weighing 100, 200 pounds. And Gus wrote, I suppose you would be pleased to know what my duties are at the tea broker's office. One of my principal duties is sampling. That is, I am sent to the different warehouses on the docks where the tea is stored to get samples of the different teas which come from China direct from the ships, or of those teas which are to be sold at public sale. You would laugh to see me traveling through the streets with a great blue bag on my back with about 50 pounds of tea in it. So this image here is a ship is right up next to the dock. And this is the hold into the ship. There are tea chests coming out of the ship. We have a couple of Chinese sailors. There are the tea chests being moved up. And here, of course, is a top-hatted clerk who has opened up a chest, and he is taking out a sample to take back to his place to value. And I have no doubt, we've gotten this far, slide number 54, that you would like to know the process of tea tasting. I will describe it, he wrote. First, you have the teas that you wish to taste in tin boxes, and they are placed in regular order before little pots and cups in which the tea is to be made. You have a pair of very delicately balanced scales in which you weigh certain portions of the tea and put it in the little pots. You have a kettle of boiling water and an instrument which measures about 5 minutes and then strikes a bell. At the moment when you pour the water upon the tea, you adjust the instrument. When the bell strikes, the tea is sufficiently brewed and it is poured into the cups for the purpose. In tasting, you endeavor to find out which tea is the best, and if the best, how much it is worth. And because the teas were all from different batches, they were sold at auction. They couldn't just be sold as kind of a single product. And at this auction, you would have a catalog that would come out. They would do 200 to 250 lots per hour, boom, 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 without a pause in the middle. And Gus wrote about the auction. Mr. Ripley has the young fellows in the sales room place a valuation on all the teas that are being put up for public sale. After the teas are sold, our valuations are compared with the prices for which they sold, and he's enabled to see how we're getting on. Now, when he was at Bullivant Wilson, he ended up doing some customs house business. And this is the customs house, and you can see it has a marvelous front on the river because the river is so important to London. And this must be where a huge amount of money came into England with all those ships and all that duty paid. And Gus, when he worked with Bullivant and Wilson, it was a smallish firm also. There were 7 clerks. There were 2, there was Gus and 2 other people in their teens, two clerks in their 20s and 2 clerks in their 30s. There were 2 principals. There was Bullivant, who didn't do much in the way of business. And then there was Mr. Wilson, who was a great man of business. And Gus wrote, he doesn't let anybody in his establishment go to sleep over his work. You kind of think of Scrooge. And so Gus ended up for them clerking and doing the custom house business, which was clearing teas from the bonded warehouses and docks. And here's an interior of the custom house. He wrote, I have to assist in making out the custom house papers, to pay the duty on the tea, to go to the customs house and pay the duty, and then to go to the different warehouses and docks where the tea lies and lodge certain papers, by which means we are able to get the tea delivered to our customers. This is a turn of the century image of a tea tasting sales room in London. It's just here to show you the scale of the tea business. You have your clerks over here at slant top desks. You have patrons in here in the middle. You have hundreds and hundreds of tins of teas. You have the spittoons, and you have the customers being helped to choose what kind of tea they want to purchase. Gus wrote, I am getting along very nicely indeed at Ripley Brothers, because he only had to spend like about 3 months with Bullivant Wilson before they decided it wasn't going to work out for him. I think I am improving myself every day. I can assure you I feel like a different person, because it turned out that Mr. Wilson was rather harsh at business. We have been quite busy at the office, as we have a great many letters to copy for the China mail, which went out today. There was a very large public sale of tea coming off tomorrow, and we had to get in samples of all the teas and place a valuation upon them. And here's another image trying to make me understand the scale of tea. This is just a room full of tea, you know? And it's a 20th century picture. And these fellows are blending tea. The English tend to like Earl Grey or English breakfast tea. The Americans at the time of the Civil War tended to drink their tea pure, and they also tended to like green tea. But Gus, this is, I don't have a picture of inspecting, but Gus also had to learn inspection. That is, learning to distinguish teas in all their different conditions by the smell, feel, and appearance of the leaf when dry. I go to different tea warehouses with our inspector. Some days we smell 1,000 chests. I just can't even imagine opening up 1,000 chests, but there we go. And now Gus writes about 3 different mariners that turned up from home. Frank Billings was a friend about his age who was sailing on the Belle Creole, and he just sent Gus a letter to Mr. Farron's office from Edinburgh, where he'd come in with a load of guano from the Chincha Islands off Peru. It turns out that that was a horrible voyage. You would go out there, you would anchor off the island, the boat would be covered with this acrid dust, and then you would fill the hold with this probably ammonia off-gassing guano, and then you would sail all the way back to England and offload. By 1874, all the deposits were gone. The Belle Creole was built in Rockport, Maine in 1862. The captain was a man named Cousins, and in 67, she shipwrecked off Port Clyde, Maine. And another fellow that came from home was Captain Hatch. And Captain Hatch seems, I don't know if he had a ship or not, but he was staying in a boarding house where he made his quarters. Gus wrote, I see Captain quite often, but he is very much disgusted with London and would like very much to return home. But he has gone into business here, and I fancy he cannot see his way clear to leave just at the moment. It's an old business, ship's chandlery, but there is so much competition here that it worries him very much. And then there was Captain Durham and his wife. And they turned out that they got here and they went and they lived on the land, and then they decided they didn't like it very much. So Gus went, he wrote that he went down to Victoria's docks and called on Captain Durham and his wife, and I found them living very quietly on board ship. And Captain Durham thought that it would be about a month before he could get away. The name of his ship was the Gibraltar. She was a ship of 746 tons. She was built in Frankfort, Maine in 1854. And in 1862, her home port was Liverpool, because many New England ships took foreign nationality during the Civil War to avoid being attacked. And now on to the tea races. Tea, of course, is an agricultural product, and it's harvested. And the first harvesting is in the late spring, and that is considered the premium new teas. And with the advent of this clipper ship, these desirable new teas could arrive in London as early as September. And Gus wrote, business with us now is very dull as we are anticipating the arrival of the new season's teas from China. Now, Gus was in 1866 with the culmination of the race of the clipper ships to bring the new tea in. Gus was already in Yokohama, but I will describe the race. That was the year that the contest to bring the new season's teas to London culminated in a race between 40 ships. 3 ships, the Ariel, the Taiping, who are shown here, and the Sirocco, left Foochow on the same tide, and they arrived in London on the same tide. The Ariel and the Taiping, both carrying over 1 million pounds of tea, arrived at the mouth of the Thames 28 minutes within 28 minutes of each other, both having sailed the 14,000 miles in 99 days. They came up the channel and stood off Gravesend, sending up flares to summon the steam tug to tow them up the Thames. The ship with the fastest tug won the race. Which is like, oh my goodness. But as we might have guessed, steam technology was taking the wind out of the clipper's sails. Auxiliary tug Earl Grey left Foochow 8 days after the Ariel and arrived 15 days before her. And she also carried 1 million pounds of tea plus passengers. The romance of the clippers seems to have passed Gus by, maybe because he was seasick all the time. But in 1863, he wrote this: "Today I've been down to Greenheath, about 20 miles down the Thames, to see a friend of mine off to China. He sails in a beautiful double screw steamer called the Far East. This is her first trip. She is going out to bring home the new season's teas and is considered one of the finest vessels of her kind afloat. My friend used to be with me at Bullivant Wilson. He goes out as a tea taster and he is a very clever young fellow. He was a very good friend to me when I first came over, and we have been friendly all along. I trust we shall meet someday in China." And thus comes the end of Gus's apprenticeship. Here is the passenger list for the SS Africa, a British mail ship sailing from Liverpool to Boston on April 1st, 1864. Previous to this afternoon, I was in Mr. Farron's office, and he told me that Mr. Andrews of Ripley Brothers had been there and said I had done well in my examination in teas, and Mr. Farron decided to send him back to America as opposed to sending him on to China. You can imagine my delight at hearing this, for I must confess I had little hope of going home before going to China. And with a little introspection, he wrote, "It is a wonderful thing how people change on leaving home and going abroad. It is but natural to suppose that I should become anglicized to a certain extent, but for all that, I am a Yankee and not ashamed to own it." In September of 1864, Gus sailed out of Boston Harbor for Hong Kong on the Waterloo under the command of Captain Babson. They sailed for 123 days nonstop. Gus wrote one long letter with journal entries during the voyage. The notations on the lines are the dates, and here are some excerpts. On the 23rd of September, dropped out of Nantastic Roads about 6 a.m. On getting outside, got a good breeze from the northwest, lost sight of Cape Cod about 4 p.m. On the 24th, heavy gale from the southeast, Rantoul, who turns out to be his fellow stateroom mate, and I fearfully seasick. And then one of Gus's phrases, "Doubtless you would like to know what the daily routine on board the Waterloo is. Rantoul and I turn out about 6 to 7 and go forward and take a saltwater bath in a large deck tub, which we consider a great institution, after which we walk the decks and exercise with dumbbells until breakfast time, which is about 8 o'clock. After breakfast, we read and write and walk until dinner, which is at 12:30. After dinner, it's much the same as after breakfast. Tea is at 5:30, after which, if it is pleasant, we stay on deck until it is time to turn in. Captain Babson is very jolly. The mates are good fellows, and everything goes on pleasantly." September, and this is happening right over here on the 28th. After breakfast, by way of amusement, I took to barbering, cut Rantoul's hair close to his head. When I got through the operation, it looked as though the rats had bitten his hair off. I made up my mind I was not cut out for a barber. And then down here, signaled the Commodore Perry from Calcutta for London. She promised to report us. She flies the English flag, but looks like an American-built ship. And then down here, exchange colors with an English steamer, a bark, and an American ship. This is the first time we have seen the American flag flying since leaving Boston. The Belt of Orion and the Southern Cross are now visible. And then down here at the bottom of the page, 32.5 days to the equator. The Neptune came aboard and initiated the greenhorns. And here we have heavy showers filled our water casks. It was very fortunate as our water was getting rather low. And then down here, they did a very good day of 254 miles. And then down here, he mentions we are now running our eastings, as it is termed. We calculate to run east for about 20 days to the longitude of 80 degrees east, and then we shall begin to go north again. Ships generally go from 5 to 10 degrees south of the Cape to get the westerly winds, which prevail in these latitudes. And then over here, had a heavy blow, running under close reefed fore and main topsails, shipping considerable water. We are rolling about so much it's impossible to eat or sleep. And then over here, I did not realize it could blow so hard. Why, it seems as though it could blow the clothes right off our bodies. And talk about seas, I never saw anything like it in the North Atlantic. And over here on the 4th, we had our most famous run of 274 miles. This is the best day's worth the captain ever made in his life, though he had been at sea for 33 years. And up here, we have getting ready for Christmas. Christmas Day, dressed in white with perspiration starting from every pore. The captain told Rantoul and I, if we liked to go skating, we might go to the lower hold. We have a patent log which tows over the stern, and last evening a shark bit off a large metal fan which is attached to it. The captain was very savage and hoped that it would choke the rascal. December 26th, the cable has been gotten from the hold and bent to the anchors. We anticipate light winds when we get amongst the islands, as there are strong currents, and it's highly probable we shall have to come to an anchor if we are close to the shore at night. Cape Blackwood cliffs with the sun shining upon them was no unpleasant sight for one who had not seen land for 2 months. On the 31st, turned out this morning at 4 o'clock and found out we were making the Straits of Timor, winds very light with a strong current against us. There's a square rigged vessel ahead standing up the channel. This is the first sail that we have seen since leaving the longitude of the Cape of Good Hope. Everything went very pleasantly until 4 p.m. and we were going out the Ombay Passage with flying colors when the wind suddenly shifted ahead and we were obliged to tack ship. In about a quarter of an hour, it fell away calm and we were left drifting about at the mercy of the current until 10 p.m. when we got a breeze, and at midnight we were in the Banda Sea. On the 8th and the 9th, we're getting close under the land. The perfume is delicious. Truly, there are spice-scented gales. And then right up about here, we are now about 1,000 miles out from Hong Kong with good prospects of being in the course of a week. We are now in the China Sea and the weather has moderated and we're moving along nicely under all sail. And here's our last slide. January 23rd, 1865, Monday. 4 months ago, we left home. We are now running up the China Sea for Hong Kong, where we expect to arrive tomorrow night. I need not tell you, I look forward to going ashore with a great deal of pleasure, for we know it could not be otherwise. And so there is Gus. Was he remarkable? I don't know, but his letters certainly opened up a world for me. I hope this has been as much a delight for you as it was for me. Thank you very much. There we go. So, all yours, Katie. Wherever Katie is. So does anybody have any questions?
Hi, I'm right here. Sorry about that. I was eating dinner. I didn't want you guys to see me chew.
Thank you, Penny. Oh my gosh. So
Yeah, thank you, Penny, so much for that talk. Absolutely wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
Like what an amazing story.
Yeah, it was beautiful, Penny. And
thank
you just gave us, you conveyed really what he faced, how he felt about things. I mean, I really felt like I understood what the tea trade was like and what it was like in London. And I didn't know about having to lead horses and humans with these torches so that you could see through the mist and the whatever it was, you know.
The London fog, yeah.
It was amazing.
Yeah.
Just very well done.
Thank
Beautiful.
you.
Yeah, the way you presented it is a great compliment to the book. I think I want to go back and read the book again now.
Well, it's
Always-
kind of the context, and I got to do more pictures than I got to do in the book. I really like
Yeah,
trying to find pictures that are of the time, and
Yeah.
yeah,
And you inserted those beautifully. I mean, they were just wonderful to see, you know, the visual along with the narrative. So they're
Right.
just very, very well put together. Awesome.
you.
Bravissimo.
And I agree with Ellen. Oh, fabulous.
Oh, good.
As someone who sailed up the, anyway, it was fabulous.
Mm.
There we
Penny,
go.
we'll talk. That's good. Thank you so
Oh,
much.
good. All right. Well, if anybody has any questions left over, you can just email me. I know a few more things, but I think I told you everything I know. I
You're a
wanted to
wealth
just
of
pack it
knowledge.
all in because, you know, the book is kind of, you know, in its own way is probably a little dry, you know, it probably just chugs along, you know, when you write a letter, you just put in, you know, this piece of information, that piece of information and toss it around. And I've been able to pull it out and pull different things together. And,
yeah.
There you did beautifully.
yeah.
Beautiful.
Thank you.
So what
And you-
happened to Gus?
So what happened to Gus? Oh, well, he did end up, he went to Hong Kong. He was in Fuzhou for a while, and then he was in Shanghai for about a year and a half. And then Heard sent him to Yokohama. And then he ended up being in Yokohama until 1875 when Heard's went bust. They went bankrupt.
right.
Oh, really?
That was a very exciting story. And then he came up with his own firm, which is when he got that tea label. He bound it up with an Englishman and another American from Maine, and they made black tea, and they sold it till just about 1895. And Gus came back in 1883 and lived in New York with his wife because his wife kept on getting sick in Yokohama.
Oh.
But when they got married, she had a grand wedding. She was from a silk family and had a grand wedding, and she had her grand piano shipped out to Yokohama.
Oh,
You know? And I never figured out if it stayed out there or if he had it shipped back again, but it arrived in
geez.
one piece without a scratch on it. So that was pretty exciting.
how
Yeah.
did they meet?
Sorry.
Oh, but so, and then he died. Gus, what happened to Gus in the very end was an appendicitis, and it got, you know, what wasn't properly done. He was cut open on the dining room table, and he died several days later. And
Oh.
you know, his son, my grandfather, was just 17 when that happened, and yeah,
Mm,
that was he was only 54, so
bummer.
that happens. Yep.
Yeah, even nowadays that happens.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, I want to really thank you for going to all the effort to put these letters out, you know, for people. They have a connection to Ipswich, of course, and there's another set of letters that are well known as during the Revolutionary War, a soldier, Joseph Hodgkins, and his wife, Sarah Hodgkins, kept up a correspondence, which has been included in many books because it's really the way you know what really happened. We get all the histories from the victors, from the you know, the important guys who get all the credit, and the poor guys like Gus who really doing all the work. You know, they're left out of history, and you brought that alive to us by making these letters available to all of us. That's really a wonderful thing.
Good. Yeah. Well, thank you for appreciating it. I do think that was, you know, a consideration when I decided to go ahead and try to publish it, is that it was a primary resource. You know, it wasn't just, I mean, we all have way too much to read. I mean, everybody, you know, even putting the book out, it's like, oh my God, you know, something more to read, please, you know. But I did think that it was capturing something, you know, that only exists then. So it's, yeah.
There was one thing that I really paid a lot of attention to the book. You didn't bring it up so much tonight, but it was how the upcoming Civil War, I guess I should say, was seen by the British. And of course, you mentioned that he fortunately escaped having to be a soldier, but the British were, it was in the news every day, apparently, wasn't it?
Oh, yes. Yeah. And they were all it's torn. There was also a shipbuilders were trying to build ships for the Confederacy, and they were in Liverpool and Manchester, probably not Manchester, but Liverpool. And they kept on saying, "Oh, these are just going to be merchant ships," but they were really ships of war, you know. And there were issues like that going on. You know, everybody war profiteering was going to be going on. Yeah. And I still wonder where Mr. Farron was when he was in Russia. What in the world was he doing in Russia? And afterwards, there are letters in which Gus writes back and says, "Don't tell anybody that he was in Russia. Don't, you know, do not tell father, keep your lips sealed." And so I wonder if Hertz was playing the other side of the game and buying guns for the South. Or, you know, what were they doing that was so, or did they just want to keep, you know, they were investing in the railways were starting to go across Russia, and maybe they were, you know, didn't want somebody to steal their investment idea. You know, I don't know why Russia. But.
Speaking of dubious trade, Penny, you mentioned opium,
Yes.
not with respect to Gus, but with respect to Augustus. And did it pop up in Gus's trade notes at any point, or did you have any further? I hadn't thought of Americans as being active in the opium trade, I have to say.
Oh, they definitely were. I mean, the British definitely, you know, I think that picture was probably the British making Indian opium, but we got our opium, the Americans got their opium from Turkey. But one of the things that happened in 1841, and so Gus doesn't mention doing anything with opium. Okay, so but in 1841, herds really set their fortune because they sold opium, because during that time the British were forbidden by the Chinese government to sell opium. So then that whole trade went to the Americans, and the Augustine herd was there just right at the right moment, and they took over the, you know, taking in the opium, and they would have all these ships that would be anchored off like Hong Kong, and they would be filled with opium, and then the Chinese would row out, and they'd do special little deals on the ship and row in, you know, and try to stay under cover of, you know. And interestingly, that you can grow opium poppies in China. But for some reason, I guess it's probably like growing marijuana. It was just so obvious that the Chinese government could come down and you know, squish you. So they didn't dare. So the Chinese people didn't dare to grow their own opium. It was easier to buy it and sneak it around. Yeah. Oh. Well.
Okay.
I think we've come to the end.
Oh, great. Penny, you were absolutely amazing.
Thank you.
I would love to have you again sometime.
All right.
We did record this, so we'll put it online, but I think there really is nothing like having someone there to talk to and answer your questions. And I'm going to put into the chat the link to join up as a member. If you want to stay informed of different talks like this, by all sorts of authors, shipbuilders, craftspeople. You can become a member and we'll send you out the email blasts all the time. We have a pretty regular thing. And if you're local, we have events and different clubs and things that go on at the museum itself. We're really excited because we can kind of start to reopen a bit since the COVID shutdown is relaxed and it's safer. So thank you all again for coming, and thank you, Penny, so much for doing this. You were really wonderful.
Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. I'm really thrilled.
Wonderful. Wonderfully done.
Thank you, Penny.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye.
Yes, probably.
Yeah. We'll have to go down here and go click.